understanding raw brown pigments so you don't get burnt. While brown can be mixed with a lot of colors around the color wheel, there is actually one color that's brown all on its own. Well, 4 colors actually. Well, only one. It's a little complicated. But in this video, I'm going to paint a model using nothing but Pigment Brown 7 with black and white. That makes it sound like a monochromatic challenge, but in this case it's really not, because PBr7 actually comes in 4 different varieties, at least in this set. Raw Sienna, Burnt Sienna, Raw Umber, and Burnt Umber, all of them included under the pigment code PBr7. That's because as a natural pigment, it's all derived from the same thing, rusted clay, iron and manganese oxides in it being what gives them the color. How they're treated and the varying amount of iron and manganese is where the color differences come from. A hydrated iron oxide will be more yellowish, while an anhydrous one will be more red. This is where the naming convention comes in. Raw means more hydrated, burnt means less, since they're essentially cooked to get the hydration out. The Umber and Sienna names are derived from regions where the colors became popular. Sienna was a city-state where the color was produced during the Renaissance, and Umber comes from the Umbria region in Italy where it was originally extracted. At least that's what my limited research on the internet tells me. But as interesting as this all is, what it means for this brown challenge is that I actually have quite a range of browns to work from. I've chosen this little Gnoll from Titan Forge's Bloodfields game to be my subject, since his fur, leather, straps, and armor will look nice in a natural brown way. I'm going to start with Raw Umber, since it's dark but more on the yellowish side of things, which I think will look good for a natural fur color, starting with just the base Raw Umber and putting down a base coat of it on all his exposed parts. Though when it comes to his mohawk, I add in a little black as well, and blend it down into where the 2 fur parts meet. The nice thing about all of these browns is they're actually quite opaque, so should cover nice and easily, though I'll still be doing 2 coats for the bases. To both of those mixes, I'm going to add a little bit of white to each, the raw umber and the raw umber with some black. As you may have guessed, the one with black is going to be a little more desaturated, which will give the highlights in the mohawk a different look to the ones that will be in his fur. His fur I highlight using my usual fur technique of drawing small lines onto the flat surfaces in a parallel pattern. Each mix gets another little bit of white, and both the colors are going to get another bout of highlighting, keeping it just a bit more sparse this time as I really don't want to go too bright with this. So the mohawk just gets some of the tips, while the fur on his body gets highlight areas like his knees, elbows, and upper neck. Hyenas usually have fur patterns, either spots or sometimes stripes, so I want to subtly add some of those to his surrounding fur. So to the base of raw umber and black, I add some more black, then lots of medium to thin the pigments out. Using a bit more of a rounded brush than a fine tipped one, I'll add spots to larger areas like his neck and top of his legs, trying not to go overboard, but also get a nice even spacing for them. Once it's all said and done, I should have a nice, dark, slightly yellow fur with dark spots patterned into it. Burnt umber being a darker and more reddish brown, I think will look great for a dark leather, which I'll be doing for his clothing. Despite it already being dark, I want to start a little darker even, so add a little bit of black to the burnt umber. This is then used to base coat the loincloth, as it could easily be a pelt of thin leather, front and back, as well as the insides, but carefully so as not to get any on the fur already painted. Using burnt umber alone, but with a little matte medium, I'm going to layer up a few layers on the upper folds of the cloth. It's not really a highlight as it's not that bright, but I want to get the difference between highlight and shadow now before I get into some wet blending for the folds of the leather later. So create that transition when the colors aren't too different. Using just some of the burnt umber and white, I make a mix of a light brown and add some more umber to the umber and medium mix I had before just to undilute it as it were. With this, I'm going to loaded brush stipple the ridges of the leather, adding just the umber to the bristles, then taking just a bit of the lighter umber on the tip. Starting with dabbing the light point on the very tip of the leather fold, I dab it outwards, going up the spine and a bit to the sides. Now that I've got the blends, I want to add the wear. Using the same mix that I used for the highlight before, I don't need to go any lighter at this point. Using a fine brush, I'll add scratches in random places and directions that intersect the blending I did on the previous step. This will add texture without adding highlight, though as it's like adding a second coat, it should be more opaque in those areas where the scratches are. And finally, I'll just add a little more white to the mix and do a few more errant scratches in the highlight areas, just to really push the rattiness of the clothing he's wearing. I like to keep some leathers nice and dark, and burnt umber is the darkest out of the bunch, and the reddish tint to it gives a nice saturated color even when adding white. Burnt sienna, at least this version of it, is a lot like a red ochre or red oxide. It has that kind of terracotta look, but isn't as bright as some. I'm going to use it on his belts and straps, first mixing in some black so that they start off darker, since it's going to be a leather just like the loincloth, carefully using the base mix to base coat the straps around his arms, legs, and waist. First thing to do after the base is going to be a semi-solid layering using just the burnt sienna. Because it's opaque, more than anything, this is going to be about getting some texture onto these straps, stippling it mostly, though quite heavily, so it only leaves texture near the fringes of where the layers end and the base coat begins. Since it's a red, if I only put white into it, it would turn a bit pink, which is great for skin tones, and actually where a lot of skin tones come from, but I need it for making scratches and highlights on a belt. So although we're not quite to it yet, I'm going to borrow some raw sienna when mixing in the white, just so it goes more orange than pink. Using this highlight to dent and scratch along the edges of the belts where they'd see the most wear. Always adding a bit of raw sienna to the white before adding it to the mix, I lighten up once again. This time though, as I layer it, I find the spots where I went a bit heavy with the previous layer, and stipple the center of that area. This should give the belt a look as though those chunks have been ripped away or fallen off through use. To blend it all together again, since I'm already in a sharing mood, I'm going to add a bit of the burnt umber to the burnt sienna to darken it, then thin it out some more with water and medium. I want to then use this mix to glaze the belts in areas where shadows would fall on them, near the buckles and on the back sides of the legs. Since the highlights were used to texture, I'll go the other way and have the shadows add the contrast. Now that he's kitted out and strapped in, there's only one thing left to do, and it's going to be an experiment for me, no doubt. Raw sienna is the in-between of a yellow and a brown. It's not as bright as a yellow oxide might be, but still can be used in the same kind of applications. Which is what my plan is going to be here. I want to do some non-metallic metal for his armor. While I think a bronze might go better with this scheme, I want to showcase the raw sienna. It's going to be more of a gold, and once again borrow one of the darker browns just to get started. Burnt umber with a little bit of the sienna to give me a base color. This getting layered over his shoulder and arm armor. Since I have black and white, I can go gray for the normal metallics when finishing him up, so just the bulky stuff for now. Doing the opposite of the last mix this time, it's mostly raw sienna with a little bit of the umber. I'm going to skip the pure raw sienna in this process, so this will be the mix I work from to get my highlights, so mix up quite a bit of it. Using this color, I layer up the outlines of where I want the reflections to be. I'd use a reference if I wasn't sure where they should go, but one secret at this point is to just make sure I leave lots of the dark brown, so there's a base for the darkest contrast. There's a few ways to blend between the light and dark areas here. The most controlled would be to mix an in-between of the two colors and stipple or glaze between the points where they change color. But I'm in a hurry, so I'm going to load my brush with the dark mix and get some of the light mix on the tip. Then, starting on the edge of the light area, loaded brush stipple to the darker side, putting a blended layer between them. For the highlights, I'm actually going to add my brightest highlights first. So lots of white going into this mix of raw sienna and umber. It's going to come out pretty stark on the model as well, adding highlights to the edges and points within the middle of the areas where I put the highlights in the last step. Trying to remember to keep this sparse since it is my brightest highlight. I wouldn't want it to cover too much. Using a smaller brush now, like what I did for the Sienna and Umber, I'm going to do for the white and Sienna, just in a much smaller area. Loading the brush with my mid mix and dipping the tip into the white mix. With this I actually start by finding the brightest point within the layer, then from there stipple it out towards the Sienna just a bit. This should not only add a ping and thicker irregularities along the highlight points, but soften the transition from it. Doing this kind of blending, the paint mixes on the model. What I had as my brightest color doesn't always stay that bright. So to just follow up the last step, I want to highlight some of the edges again with the same light mix I used before, just to make sure those edges really stand out as edges. This is pretty nice for a quick non-metal metal, but it's still a bit rough. So I'm just going to add one last little blend layer, using some pure burnt umber to do a very light glaze from just outside the highlights to the dark areas. Putting a soft layer over top all of it just to filter some of the differences between layers. And with that, I've used all 4 of the browns more or less to themselves, though there's still lots of little things to do, but with a quick cross zoom, it's finished. I stuck to just the browns and blacks and whites for all the knickknacks as well. The ropes a shade of orange by mixing both the Siennas, metallics were just black and white, non-metal metal, bone was a very bright version of both the raw shades mixed. The mouth, some burnt Sienna, and white without the raw Sienna to stop it going pink, which means other than black and white, in all technicalities, this whole model was painted with a single pigment, as far as pigment codes are concerned anyway. Oh, you didn't see that, but I was winking when I said that. Anyway. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one, or just other fun things to do with painting miniatures. And until next time, enjoy your own painting journey.